So thank you, whoever's on there, for joining us today for the Clinical Trials Methodology course webinar. The topic today is study sections and clinical trials. Before we begin, I want to just remind you to please mute your phones when you're not speaking. You may unmute to ask questions or type your questions in the chat feature at the top of your screen. Also, please make certain to evaluate the webinar, especially if you would like CME credit for attending today. And the link to the evaluation is in the chat box. And lastly, please mark your calendars for our next webinar on October 1st at noon Eastern. The topic is good clinical practice, and that will be the last one of the series. So I'd now like to introduce today's presenters, Drs. Jaideep Kapur and David Wright. Dr. Jaideep Kapur is the Eugene Meyer III Professor of Neuroscience, Professor of Neurology at the University of Virginia. He has a long-standing interest in understanding the neurobiological mechanisms underlying status epilepticus. Another area of research is regulation of seizures by hormonal fluctuations, and his research is supported by grants from the National Institutes of Health, Epilepsy Foundation, Cure Epilepsy Foundation, and the Department of Defense. Dr. David Wright is a professor of emergency medicine, vice chair for research, and director of emergency neurosciences at Emory's University School of Medicine. Dr. Wright has been actively involved in both the preclinical and clinical assessment of traumatic brain injury and stroke for the past 20 years. He participates in numerous concussion research and technology development endeavors and has also served on multiple NINDS grant review panels over the past 15 years. So I would like to give a special thank you to both our presenters today for their time and presentation. And none of our presenters have any commercial or financial interests or relationships or conflicts of interest to disclose. Dr. Kapur?
So, good morning, good afternoon to both of you or all of you. Welcome to this session. So, if you do research, you will end up writing research grants, and there are certain techniques to writing NIH grants, which seem complex, but they can be understood and they can be addressed. So any application is reviewed for 5 criteria, and what I'll do is to speak about the review criteria, and then David will speak exactly about the review process, and I'm speaking about review criteria so that you address them when you write your grants. So significance is the first scored review criterion on which you'll receive a separate score when your grant is reviewed. And within the significance section, it's important to define the problem and demonstrate its impact. And what I mean by that is it's important to define the public health impact, or if it is not a huge public health problem, define how it impacts care of patients or their outcomes. A common pitfall that I'm observing in reading grants, clinical grants, is that people, especially young investigators, address a knowledge gap that they are very interested in. A knowledge gap by itself does not become a significant clinical problem. A significant clinical problem is a problem which, if solved, would lead to improved diagnosis, treatment, or prognostication of a subject. So it should impact patient care in some fashion or the other, and it should be demonstrably impact patient care since we're talking about clinical translational projects, so that if you successfully complete it, you see an impact on it. The second scored criterion is innovation, and innovation sometimes confounds people because, especially in clinical translational studies, you want to be doing work that is well established and methodologically sound. So you want to you're shy of innovation in that way. However, if your study includes a technological or methodological or conceptual innovation to speak about it. Uh, Also, you can talk about early adoption and first adoption of a novel technology. You can talk about novel trial design or novel outcome measures, uh, or a novel hypothesis that challenges an existing paradigm. So, what is new or novel about your project should be mentioned. Next slide, Joy. Joy, next slide. So,
Sorry.
I got
Oh,
it. So,
I'm sorry. It's not working. It's like frozen. Let me try one more time. Sorry. Do you see that
yeah,
approach?
it's still
Okay.
so. Yeah, got it. So, in under approach, and as David will point out to you in his uh, presentation, approach is one place where you will find the most rigorous assessment of your grant, where people tend to get really tough. So within approach, begin by preliminary data. This is your opportunity to show that you're capable of doing the project, that it is feasible. uh, Recruitment, feasibility of any assay that you're doing. For example, if you want to record EEGs in the emergency department, show that you can actually do it, or you want to do a new MRI technique using a 7 Tesla magnet, make sure that you have access to that 7 Tesla magnet and you put a few people through it, even if the university bought the machine. That helps. Any unpublished innovation that is critical for your grant, you want to address right here. And uh, then you get to the approach itself, and your aims should be very clearly laid out and address what exactly will happen. There should be no doubt in reviewers' mind exactly what uh, will happen, so that your inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria are clear, unambiguous, and enrollment mechanism, intervention, all those are very clearly laid out, uh, so that there is no debate within study section that what you intended to write. Sometimes as reviewers, you're trying to read between the lines as to what exactly is the applicant stating. So be clear and precise in delineating what will happen in the study. Next slide. Again, one of the first things in planning a grant should be try to figure out what your primary outcome will be. It should be clearly stated, it should be easy to perform, easy to understand, and it should be feasible so that your study teams, whether it is a investigator or a research coordinator or a blinded investigator, can do it. And you're sure that if it is a multi-site study, that investigators at each site can do it, that it is reproducible, rigorous, and sensitive and specific to what you intend to measure. If you're using, for example, an MRI technique and it is not sensitive or specific to what you're looking for, that would be a criterion for criticism. So here, and you can use this word, rigor comes in. Rigor and reproducibility have become important scored criteria, and it's important for you to address rigor in assessing primary outcome. Then justify all your secondary outcomes. They're less important, but they still need justification. I'm assuming that your statistical analysis plan would go in a separate package, but if it is a part of the grant, make sure that it again shows rigor and there is clear justification of expected effect size and sample size. There is usually a biostatistician on a study panel, and they can smell it when the sample size is that of convenience rather than based on rigorous evaluation of possible effect size. Again, anticipate that reviewers will know that recruitment into clinical studies is a big problem. It speaks to feasibility of your study. Make sure that you defend that you will be able to recruit sufficient number of subjects. And again, don't just go through your clinical data repository and say we saw 10,000 cases of head injury last year, so we'll recruit all of them into this large study. Be realistic in estimating how many of those would be eligible for your study. And even if they're eligible, of those eligible, how many would you actually be able to recruit into your trial? And be a realistic, do an estimate and check with your senior colleagues, people who've done this before, if they agree with you that you're making a fairly realistic claim with regards to your ability to recruit sufficient subjects. Try to address inclusion of women, children, and minorities and a safety plan in the main application very briefly, then address it, then refer them to the human subject section of your grant and address it there. Next slide. So environment is important to demonstrate that there are adequate institutional and network support for you to do the study that you're proposing to do. If you're doing it at a single institution, make sure that school, university resources, infrastructure, and people that are around to help you are listed. Often institutions have these boilerplate language, but begin with that boilerplate language that is available for that institution, but make sure to highlight what is significant and relevant to your grant and what you're writing. It's quite important to make sure that people, that reviewers know that you have all the infrastructure to do this right. If you're going to work with a group of sites or a network of sites, make sure that there are network resources. Also make sure you talk about how network coordination would occur, where the coordination between sites would occur and how would it occur. What are the mechanics of collaboration? Again, that's important also in terms of investigators, because you'll have multiple investigators. If you have more than one investigator in your study, then make sure that you talk about multi-investigator plan and how you will handle that. If you, as a new investigator, make sure that you list your strengths and weaknesses in the biosketch, and you address your weaknesses usually by using collaborators. It's increasingly obvious that research, especially clinical research, requires multiple people to execute a project well. So make sure that you have others helping you out to do this and to do this right. So study sections are very sensitive to lack of expertise in a specific area. There is an online tool to create your biosketch. I use that, but you can create your own. Your grants office will go through it and check that it meets the NIH criteria for appropriate biosketch formatting. Next slide. So you'll need institutional support and administrative support to submit the grant. Just remember, you don't submit the grant, your institution does. For large multi-center grants, it takes a lot of planning and negotiation ahead of time. So plan 6 months ahead of a grant submission deadline, because you have to get site budget, support letters, subcontract negotiations, all that has to go on. Even if you have multiple collaborators from multiple departments within your institution, you should prepare budget early, revise it often, make sure that all collaborators agree on the budget and their role in the project. I realize that as you write a grant, the role of your collaborators may change, but try to be as transparent as possible about what you're expecting them to do, what would their effort be on the grant, and uh, their letters and letters from their chairs reflect those kinds of things. As you prepare your budget, make sure that you justify each item and person, especially if your budget is non-modular, which often is the case in clinical grants. Remember that if your budget is more than $500,000 per year, then you have to get NIH permission to, and make sure that you have support letters as you need them. It's good to have those, especially when there are complex things involved. Next slide. So I'm going to begin with the summary statement, but David will truly demystify it because he'll go over exactly what happens at study section and which makes it much easier to understand. But your summary statement will come in, will give you the review group. In fact, you can read who all were in your review group. Please don't try to assume who reviewed your grant. I've reviewed grants for decades and I've written grants for decades. And one thing I've come to conclude is that my guesses about who said what about me is probably consistently wrong. And what people assume about me saying things about them is also consistently wrong. So just look at the review group and their expertise, but not their personal biases. Your impact score ranges from 10 to 90, and David will go over scoring criteria in great detail. Key thing to read in a study is the summary of discussion. This is what was said about the grant at the study section. The SRA, the scientific review officer who's running the study section, is taking notes and summarizing the discussion as it happens. Remember that after reviewers have read the grant, they come and discuss it, and their thoughts and opinions about the grants change. So this summary is very important, and it's very useful to read it very carefully. Then what follows are individual reviews. These were largely written before the meeting was held, before the reviewers came to meet, and David will go over these in great detail with you. I've mentioned that they'll score you for significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. Once again, I'd emphasize that approach is where grants go down or up most commonly. Others can be difficult, but approach is the one to spend most time on. After scores are discussed, what happens, the chair of the study section goes through a series of what they call administrative points, where they say protection of human subjects, data safety monitoring plan, and the reviewer, usually the primary reviewer, replies yes or no, adequate or not adequate. Here, these things have to be adequate. For clinical studies, obviously human subjects inclusion in making sure that your population is inclusive and diverse in all aspects is very important, and that even though it's not a scored criterion, it will creep into people's approach to scoring your grant. Similarly, budget and period of support are not supposed to be scored criteria, but somehow they color the reviews as people review a grant. If they think a grant is $10 million, which is worth only $2 million, somehow that will reach their scored criterion. So I'll stop at that, and David will pick up and start talking about study section.
All right. Well, welcome again, and thank you, Jaideep. So I'm going to actually have a few questions here that I'm going to just kind of throw out there. But I did want to back up just a little bit. So we're talking about your grant. You're working on writing the best grant that's going to get the best review. and we are going to go through some of those details as to what winning grant looks like, or maybe even more important is what a losing grant has in it that makes it lose, so or get scored low. But in the process, so you're writing this, just to kind of understand the mechanics of this a little bit, when you submit your grant, for the most part, you're going to be submitting this in response to an RFA or a call for proposals, whatever you want to call that. And there's a number of names, FOA, RFA, and we won't go through that. You can Google the definitions of those. But some of those will come out of individual NIH groups, like the NIH Clinical Trials Study Section. A number of RFAs will come out that will specifically be channeled into that review group. However, most investigator-initiated studies actually will go to something called the Center for Scientific Review. And this is really just a collecting house or warehouse for all the grants to kind of come into, and then they get dispersed out based on topic and area of interest to one of the many review groups that have been put together that are essentially topic-based, and your grant could go to any of those. So if it's a basic science grant that's in the neurologic space, it may go to one of the multiple, actually there are multiple neuroscience review committees for basic science studies or a clinical study. If it's a neurologic clinical trial, and that's sort of what we're talking about here for the most part, it's likely to go to NINDS's clinical trials group. And that's sort of the one that I've been a part of, and so that's where most of the mechanism and approach and how things are being done in the committee. That's my experience. Some of these things can be done a little bit differently in some of the other review groups. It really depends on the person who is running those review groups. And so, but just so you understand that it depends on whether it's an investigator initiated or whether it's really in response to a particular RFA as to which study section gets your grant. You can request certain study sections. So, for example, if your grant fits into a specific topic area and there are more than 2 or 3 study sections that seem to fit it, and you look and you think that it might be more favorable on one study section or the other, there is the ability when you write the program officer and when you submit the grant in your cover letter to request a particular study section. Doesn't mean it's going to be granted, but there is that opportunity to do that. So let me move on into, that was just sort of a higher level review of kind of what happens to your grant when you submit it. And by the way, it goes into that big, I think of it like Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse, where they have all at the very end of it. You just see millions and millions of grants piled high. Now it's electronic. It used to be paper where you had to submit like 7 copies. So it's a lot better, but it still gets sorted in this Center for Scientific Review and then gets it to the appropriate study section. So let's talk about a few more practical things. So what study sections love and hate? And again, remember, study section review members are not paid. Essentially, this is a service that's kind of given back to NIH, and all of the study section members have written and gotten grants through NIH. That is one of the criteria for choosing study section members. And they have a whole rubric for what it takes to get on study section, which is a different lecture if you're interested in doing that, or a different talk. But one of those is that you had to have at least some experience in writing and receiving research dollars, typically from NIH. So all of these folks are pretty experienced people that are going to be reviewing your grant. And again, although they're quote unquote paid for their travel, for the most part, it's peanuts. It's like $200 for 2 days worth of work. It's ridiculous. I don't even know why they bother or what they trouble with it. But That's what it is, and it's an immense amount of time to review these grants. So if you can imagine, if you're reviewing 5 to 10 clinical trials, sometimes these things are literally 100 pages to 300 pages, depending on how much information is provided in the appendices and all other aspects of it. So it's not just the grant body, it's looking at the budget, looking at all the other pieces. So it's an enormous amount of time that the reviewers spend or can spend on this. So what your goal is, and you need to put your cap on here, and with the primary goal of making it easy on the reviewer. The easier you make it on the reviewer, the better your chances are. I can tell you, even though it may be a minor mistake, minor editing, minor grammar, it can really flip a switch on a reviewer when they're reading through this and they have grammar issues, and it just puts everything in a bad light. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what study sections 11 hate, and then we're going to talk about again the mechanics of the study section, what happens to your grant when it comes in, and then a little bit I'll add on to what Jaideep said about the review criteria. And then sort of this kind of what everybody fears is the ND, and we'll talk about what is ND. So let's first, next slide, go to what study sections love and hate. And I'll spend just a little bit of time on this because these things sound so simple, but it's so, when you get into writing your own grant, you feel you're so immersed in it that it's really hard for you to take a big picture and look at it with unbiased eyes. So the first thing I'll say is you should write this grant and have it ready well before the submission date, not to the last minute, so that you can have other experienced people review your grant and at least read through it, not necessarily for grammar, although that's an important piece, but just so you can have some other folks look at it and make sure you're not missing some really important points or confusing to people. Again, your job is to make this easy on the reviewer because the reviewers aren't necessarily experts in exactly what you're talking about. They're expert neuroscientists, but I don't have much of a clue when it talks about Parkinson's disease and you start getting into the sort of basic science of Parkinson's disease. It just will go over my head. So you have to make it where, although they're very intelligent, they're smart, and they do have areas of expertise, not everybody in the room is going to understand your grant at the very granular detail. So if you get too deep too quick and you don't explain it, it's not exactly like writing a grant that your mother could read, but it is, the clearer you are, the better it is. So first thing that really kills a grant is if it's sloppy. It will just, if you've got spelling errors throughout, if you've got grammar errors, if it's confusing, you start talking about one topic and you move to another in the next paragraph, all of that is absolutely critical. And this is where it'd be really good if you had even a non-science person read it and say, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, but it makes sense to me at a high level. The other is too dense. People pushing the margins, making the font as small as is allowable, pushing the distance between. Used to, they would actually get out on paper and measure the distances between words and letters because there was a very finite rule for, what the font size is and all of those types of things. I think they do less of that now. I'm not quite sure they are quite stringent on that, but nonetheless, you want to make it aesthetically pleasing to the reviewer, that it follows. If you have some images that can help explain something better than text, do it, because those can help. Recognizing they take up space, so they have to be really important, but that's one of the things you want to do. One of the big mistakes that junior people writing grants do is they're overly ambitious. They'll have 5, 6, 7 aims, or they'll have they want to solve the world's problem in one grant. And NIH just wants success, right? So they want, at the end of the day, that when they fund you, that you can actually achieve what you wrote and said that you can do, and that you answer the questions you're asking. So that's the important piece of this. Don't be overly ambitious. You may look at it and go, well, is this really big enough or important enough? And a lot of this has to do with what your mechanism is. If you're going for an R21 pilot type study versus a big R01 project, there are differences in what how much you should put in there. But avoid the multiple outcomes or the multiple aims. If you can get 1, 2, and at the most 3 aims, certainly if you're a junior person, I would go with that, because clearness and clarity in what you're trying to do is really the key. Another fatal flaw in these grants is folks will write aim 1 and then aim 2, and both of those aims will be equally important for the project, because aim 1 may be half the budget and aim 2 half the budget. But if aim 2 is completely dependent on the success of aim 1, then you won't get funded, because what will happen is they're going to go, well, what happens if aim 1, and then all of a sudden you've been funded for both aims. So you really, the aim 2 needs to, or the aims need to be somewhat independent. In other words, if you do 1, you can still do 2 and get good information out of it. So think about that. It takes a little bit of deep thought to kind of figure out how to structure that, because oftentimes when we're thinking through a process logically, one thing right after another, we end up creating these dependent scenarios. And so making things sort of stand on their own. Okay, this answers this question, this answers this question, this answers this question. So that's the way you need to stage it. Jaideep talked a little bit about statistical support in writing the stats part of your grant. Oftentimes, there are always stats reviewers in the room, usually 2, 3, maybe even 4 stat reviewers in the review section. The one way to put a death nail into your grant is to have a stats person on it for 2 to 3, 5% effort. They will see that as hollow and that you did not or were not serious about stats, or that stats were an afterthought. And so be realistic with the statistical support, especially if it's an R01, for example, because that's going to require heavy lifting and even the writing of your grant. So this really is more of a lesson for getting the stats person involved before you write the grant. When you have the concept and the idea, make sure that you have stats on board, because they can help you structure this. That's much more logical. And of course, nowadays the real what do you call it? The fad is adaptive designs. So everything needs to be in an adaptive design. So how you structure your study is really, really dependent on the statistical approach. So again, I would get them involved very, very early. Some of these are obvious. Poor justification for your approach. I won't go into that. Jaideep talked a fair amount about that. Crazy budgets. In general, the budget section is discussed after the review scoring. However, I will tell you that if your budget is outrageous or you have a lot of fluff in it, and tell me, these reviewers know when you have fluff in there, it can unfortunately bias the scientific review, even though it's not supposed to. And we'll talk about this and how the reviews are done. But budgets are at the end, and it's supposed to be independent of the science, but sometimes it can taint it. And then, of course, they're very serious about human subjects, as they should be. So your human subjects section should be robust, very well explained. And now there's also a lot of importance on gender and equity in your grant if you're dealing with humans, and making sure that you have, and even if you're dealing with animals, you're supposed to explain the inclusion or non-inclusion of one gender or another, and even pediatrics. So those are the things that need to have a lot more explanation than in the old days than they used to. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we love, we like clean, very well laid out, and a beautiful story. So remember, when you're writing this, it's a story. You're trying to convince someone who you don't know to give you 200, 500,000, a million, $2 million. So just imagine that. So they're going to look at this skeptically to begin with. Their job is to find error in your approach. So even though that doesn't feel good, that's really what they're doing. So you need to justify and write the story that convinces someone to write you a check. So solid connections between the significance, what is the importance of answering this question? Does it really change the field? Or does it really solve a problem? Or are we sort of making up a problem and just, writing a grant about it? And that sounds silly, but you'd be surprised how many grants really don't move the needle very much, even if the grant was completed. You can look at use your FINER, which is the feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant rule. It really does fit here. But again, making sure that it meets all those characteristics. A thoughtful discussion on limitations. So don't think that if you don't mention it, the reviewers aren't going to know it. They will. These are experienced people. They'll see the limitations, and if you don't address them, that could be a fatal flaw. If you address them and have a plan, or at least a justification, that's a lot better. So Jaideep talked a little bit about pilot data or pilot study or preliminary data. There used to be a completely separate section for preliminary data. Now you have to sort of roll it in. But it's very important that if you are not a fifth generation grant awardee and have not done multiple clinical trials, then you will need to justify or at least demonstrate that you have the experience or you have the ability to do enrollment. So, or that the science that you're discussing or talking about is reasonable. It's true that people who have had multiple grants or have done research before kind of get a pass here. It almost seems unfair to some degree, but you have to understand that, I know Jaideep, and if his, of course, I wouldn't be reviewing his because it'd be a conflict. But if I was reviewing his, I go, yeah, this guy's done multiple clinical trials. He's done them all successfully before. His science is solid. He knows what he's doing. If it's somebody I don't know, I'm going to go, can they really enroll all of these people that they say they're going to enroll? Do they have the connections to do this? So this is where getting co-PIs or co-investigators on your grant that can be supportive, who are highly experienced, is important. There are some grants that are go, no-go grants. So these are grants where they specifically ask you to put in there what would make you stop versus go to the next level. Sometimes these are phase 2 clinical trials, heavily go, no-go grants, and they want you to address what would make you move forward, or what would make you stand still, or say, okay, we're done. If it asks for that statement, be absolutely sure, in quotes, you put that information in there, and you say, this is the go, no-go data. This is the result I'm looking for. A 10% improvement in X says we're going to the next level. That's very important, because it's surprising how many times the RFA says there is to be a go, no-go statement, and there isn't one included. And we already talked about statistical support. So next slide. Okay, so what happens in study section? And it's a bit scary when your grant is getting reviewed. And how is a study section made up? Next slide. So this is from a movie called The Angry 12 Men or something like that. Actually, go ahead to the next slide. There you go. Yeah, 12 Angry Men, Henry Fonda movie. It's apparently famous. I've never seen it. But it's someone's fate is based on this 12 men, all white old men, right? It's not exactly like that. Next slide. But they do decide the fate of your grant. So it's usually a very diverse group of people. There is a variety, depending on the study section, of expertise, usually clinical trialists, usually statisticians, really deep content experts on, for example, in the NINDS clinical trials group, there'll be stroke experts, there'll be traumatic brain injury experts, if there is a TBI grants to be reviewed. Sometimes there won't. It depends on the grants. So the study section, to some degree, there are standing members in the study section that serve for several years as part of it. But they also bring in what they call ad hoc members if there is a content expertise needed that the group doesn't currently have. So if there's a traumatic brain injury grant coming through the NINDS study section and there was nobody on it that was a neurosurgeon or that worked in traumatic brain injury, they would find an ad hoc reviewer to come in and be one of the reviewers for at least the scientific content expertise. So they make these groups up. Again, they usually pull them in for in-person meetings. The grants are sent out to them and divided up based on expertise. There's always statistical reviewers on it. There's now usually a basic science person that reviews the preclinical data to say, is it ready for clinical trial? And that's not new now, but 5 years ago, that was sort of a new approach, was because there's so many failures of translating studies from basic sciences to clinical trials. They now actually have a whole piece where, before you even get into the rest of the review, they'll ask this basic scientist, what is the body of literature that supports this approach moving into a clinical trial? So there needs to be good evidence in the preclinical, if you're doing a clinical trial, to move it forward, at least in the NINDS study section that I was a part of. So this is the group. You will be assigned a primary reviewer and then several secondary reviewers. And the primary reviewer is the one who, all of those reviewers that are assigned your grant will read your grant. The primary reviewer will be the one who will summarize to the rest of the group your grant, what your objectives are, what your outcomes are, and then it'll move to the secondary reviewers to give their opinion on the grant. The room may have 30 people in it, just like the picture that you see here. You may only have 5 or 6 reviewers, depending on, again, on the study section and on the grant. So the rest of the folks in the room may not have read your grant. They all have access, but for the most part, they don't read them, because that would be 100 and something grants that they have to read, and they just don't do it. So they're sitting and listening to these 5 reviewers talk about your grant in exquisite detail. And many of them in the room have some content expertise, some of them just structural expertise on approach and things like that. And so the committee is saying, or the reviewers are really giving their opinion of how well your grant is, how important it is, what problem it's solving, how big is this problem, and how well is your approach written. And they've got to convince the whole group, because the whole group ends up voting, not just the 5 people who reviewed your grant. But if your primary reviewer doesn't like your grant and is a negative review, that's a real problem. So you pray for a good review from your primary reviewer, and they often are the champions, because it's sort of like their grant, their group of grants. They're really championing it for them. If it's worth championing, they will champion it. But that's it. Next slide. So Jaideep went into this, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the scoring. The reviewers will give an initial score online, electronically, before the meeting starts, after they've read it. Then the discussion begins. That is your reviewers that reviewed your grant, not everybody, of course. Then the discussion begins, and you'll go through the 5 different elements that Jaideep talked about, all the way through approach. And then the opportunity to rescore the grant happens. So a lot of it depends on the discussion that occurs in the room. After your primary reviewer and secondary reviewers present the information, there's a discussion from all the people in the room, and it really gets quite lively, actually. And then there's sort of the pro people, the con people, and then they ask for scores. And then they get scores from your reviewers plus everybody else in the room. Those go into an electronic system. They get averaged up. And then they close the grading of it, the scoring of it, and then move on to ethics and budget. But this is the scoring that we use, which is exceptional, outstanding, excellent, very good. Now, what do those really track to? And I think maybe on the next slide, do I have it in the next slide? Yes, okay. So read this. This is really important, okay? So if you get a 3 or a 4, you've got a pretty doggone good grant. Now, most fundable ranges are 1 to 2.5. Sometimes a 3 can get in, depending on the budget year and all sorts of other things. But a 3 and a 4 is a pretty good grant, because look at what that means. A 3 is very strong with only minor weaknesses. And yes, that makes me panic just to think about that and sweat. You've got to have a superb grant to get into the exceptional and outstanding. Those are pretty much assured funding. Again, this committee does not decide funding. This committee only decides the grade of your grant. It moves on after to what they call council. Several months later or a month later, council reviews priorities of the study section of NIH, and will make some decisions. And for the most part, though, it's for the grants that are on the bubble. Like there's a little bit of money left. Which of the ones that are 2.9 or 3.1 will they fund? But this is the scoring system, and so this is why it's important that you need to have multiple people read your grant before you submit it, because even small weaknesses can knock you down. But it also gives you some hope that if you get a score of 4 or 5, it's fixable. You just need to work on it and respond to the reviewers, because the reviewers will give you a very detailed explanation of why you scored what you scored. Okay, next slide. All right, we already talked about this. You get your primary reviewer. Let's go ahead and move on. I'm not going to go over this. This is even hard for me to read on here in much detail, but this grid should help you, and it's available on the NIH website or on these slides, of course. And it's 2016, so it'd be worth looking to see if there's a newer version. But each type of grant has its own criterion, so you need to make sure that that you are answering all of the and providing all the elements that each grant needs. Okay, move on. So at the end, as I mentioned, there is an overall impact score that's given that is not necessarily a summary of the remaining scores. So there's significance section, how important is this to the field? There's the investigator piece, which is how experienced is this team? How can they do it? Can they actually complete this, given the people they have on the team? Innovation, and this is the one that Jaideep talked about. This is the one that causes a lot of people angst, because if your trial is too innovative, then you don't have any preliminary data, and people say it's it's a stretch. If it's too non-innovative, then they'll say, well, it's not innovative enough. So it's sort of a damn if you do, damn if you don't. But you just have to be clever about what's the innovation about this, but that you can do it. But as Jaideep said, 90% of the review is on the approach. So can you enroll the patients you say you're going to enroll? Is there good evidence that there are that many patients available? Does your hypothesis and your outcomes make sense? Can you do these outcomes? Are they the right outcomes? To be able to do the study. So this is where you really want to spend a lot of your time on. And then environment almost gets a pass if you're at a good academic setting. If you're in private or community, this is a little bit harder bar for you to reach. But for the most part, that's it. The overall impact score, though, is kind of a combination of, is it an important question? And can this group answer that question? And if they answer it, will it move the field? And so that's really what that overall impact score is. It will make a big impact if A, B, C, and D. And so not an average necessarily of those. And that's the big score. So you may see these, they may have the scores embedded in your reviews, and that's what they really mean. And then there's the human subjects and budget section, and then training grants have their own criteria. Okay, move on. All right, so ND, we're wrapping this up here. So what is not discussed? Not discussed just means you are in the bottom 50% of the scores before study section happened. And they decided that the program or the manager will send out a request. Is it okay if we not discuss this particular? Now, with some of the ones that are in the lower score, the reviewers have an opportunity to say, yeah, I want to discuss it, and so they'll discuss it. But for the most part, it's just the bottom 50% of the grant scored. That doesn't mean that your grant is not fixable. Again, remember, a lot of the scores could have been 2.1, 2.3. Yours was a 4, but it was sort of outside of the range of the other grants. So just don't be too disheartened by that, and read the reviewers. You will still get all the reviews of the reviewers. You just won't, of your primary reviewers, you just won't have the benefit of all the other people in the room providing discussion. Okay, next slide. Yes, and for the most part, you can reapply, and all of us do. Very few people get their grant on the first try. Next slide. And so this is akin to, for those of you who don't know, that is David Wright of the Mets, and that's who I introduced myself as. Of course, we are not the same. But I like to use the analogy of baseball, that it's really how many times you're up at bat. So you just need to keep trying. Remember, a batting average of 200 to 300 is exceptional. So if you're getting 2 out of 10 grants or 2 out of 10 shots, you're doing well. Next slide. That's fine. See, so David Wright's batting average 281. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, that's my part.
So thank you both. Are there any questions or comments? Let's see here. One question about dependent goals. When writing a grant for a clinical trial, would the primary outcome be aim 1 and secondary, and the same trial be aim 2?
So primary and secondary aims are fine, and your secondary aims can be somewhat dependent aims. What you don't want is 2 primary aims, and you can't have 2 primary aims or 2 big aims based on however your project is and how it's funded. You can have some secondary aims that are somewhat dependent, but really the secondary aims are just subparts of your your primary aim to some degree. But one of the things you're going to want to do if you have secondary aims is make sure that for the most part you have the power to answer them. Some people mistakenly only do their power analysis on their primary aim, and they say, oh, it's just a secondary aim, and they don't power it. And oftentimes that will get a significant negative review. So if you're going to put in a secondary aim, make sure you have the power to answer it.
Okay, any other questions or comments? We have a couple minutes. Okay, well, if you do have questions later on, just email me and I can forward them on to our presenters. So thank you again, Drs. Kapur and Wright. And I just want to remind everyone the webinar for next week will be October 1st at noon on good clinical practice. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you again.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joy.